Courtroom trembled in silence as the gavel struck, and Judge Richard declared a verdict that left the air suffocating. Laura clenched her hands together, whispering, "This cannot be the end," her voice nearly lost in the echo. Across the room, Investigator James leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, as if reading the truth hidden between the lines of the ruling. He knew the weight of silence and how often it masked corruption. The warm comforter, Emma, placed a steady hand on Laura's shoulder, her calm words carrying weight. Emma said, "You must hold on. Justice has not yet slipped away." The reluctant fire starter, Adam, smirked from the back bench, his restless energy seeping into the room as he muttered, "No one ever sees what's right in front of them." James felt the sting of Adam's words. He had carried scars too long, and tonight, they pulsed like fire. When the courtroom emptied, a phone rang in the darkness of James' pocket. A trembling voice whispered from the other end, "They know what you've done, and they are coming." James froze in place, staring into the void of the hallway as shadows closed in, and in that breathless moment, the real story began. The courthouse steps groaned beneath heavy rain, as Investigator James stood beneath a flickering streetlight. Laura pressed close to Emma, whispering, "How can truth vanish when everyone has seen it?" Emma answered with calm certainty, "Truth bends, but it never breaks." Adam trailed behind, flipping his soaked sketchbook, muttering, "You don't see the ghosts I see." James lit a cigarette, the flame shaking against the downpour. He whispered, "The verdict was not justice, it was theater." Lightning struck, illuminating the marble pillars where Judge Richard passed under an umbrella, his figure framed like a relic of authority. James felt the call replay in his head, a voice warning of shadows. He clenched his jaw. The storm was not only in the sky, it was within every fractured soul on those steps. James returned to his office, walls lined with fading case files and scattered photos. He poured whiskey into a glass, staring at a sealed envelope resting in the drawer, untouched for years. Laura's voice echoed in his memory, "Promise me you won't stop." Emma's soothing presence lingered like warmth that turned to smoke. Adam's laugh echoed, unsettling and sharp. The storm outside raged, shadows leaping across the cracked blinds. James whispered to himself, "Someone buried the truth, and tonight I'll dig it back." The phone vibrated again, the same number as before, yet silence answered when he picked up. He dropped the receiver, his heart tightening. The city groaned beyond the window like a restless beast. The next morning, Emma met Laura at a cafe hidden beneath steel awnings, the rain now faded to mist. Laura said softly, "Every verdict feels like a funeral." Emma stirred her tea, her eyes unwavering. She replied, "Funerals remind us of what was real, and what was stolen." Adam appeared suddenly at their table, drenched, tossing a folded paper onto the wood. On it was a sketch of Judge Richard shaking hands with a shadowy figure. Laura gasped. Emma whispered, "Where did you see this?" Adam shrugged, smirking, "Shadows leave bigger footprints than people notice." The morning light filtered through steam, carrying both comfort and dread. By dusk, James found himself driving along the edge of the city, headlights cutting through rain-slicked streets. His mind replayed Laura's desperate eyes, Emma's quiet assurances, Adam's defiance, and Judge Richard's distant authority. The envelope remained in his pocket, heavier than steel. The phone rang once more, and this time a voice said, "Truth costs blood." His grip on the wheel tightened until his knuckles paled. The city lights blurred into streaks of red and gold, as if the world itself bled. James whispered into the rain-drenched glass, "Justice is worth everything, even the last breath." The car disappeared into the storm, and with it, so did the boundary between truth and danger. The storm settled into fog by dawn, and Investigator James paced across his dim office, papers scattered in uneven piles. Laura arrived quietly, her voice quivering as she said, "They never listened, James, not once." He studied her trembling hands, knowing fear had rooted deep in her bones. Emma entered soon after, bringing warmth that filled the silence. Emma said, "We will steady each step, no matter how heavy." James turned to the sealed envelope, brushing its corner with his thumb, as though it held both ruin and salvation. Adam barged in, wet sneakers squeaking, slamming his sketchbook onto the desk. Adam said, "You want answers? Look in the margins. That's where the truth hides." James's jaw tensed, a muscle twitching with every word. Outside, the city's noise crept in like a restless ghost. The phone vibrated again, silent after the first ring, and James muttered, "Every warning carries a cost." Shadows stretched longer, and Act 2 truly began. Laura followed Emma to a quiet park, the grass slick with dew, and the air heavy with morning chill. Laura said, "I keep hearing echoes of their laughter, as though they know I failed them." Emma placed a reassuring arm around her, whispering, "You didn't fail, you survived when the world demanded sacrifice." Laura stared at the empty swings, tears rolling quietly down her cheek. Emma's voice remained steady, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Emma thought of past compromises, choices never revealed, shadows never confessed. The distant church bells tolled, hollow against the still air. Laura clung to Emma's sleeve, murmuring, "James cannot carry this weight alone." The park seemed frozen in stillness, but beneath that calm surface, hidden truth stirred like a serpent beneath grass. James met Adam in a deserted warehouse at the edge of the city, the air thick with rust and oil. Adam waved his sketchbook like a weapon, grinning. "You see them in the shadows, but I draw them in daylight." James' eyes narrowed, replying, "Truth written on walls means nothing without proof." Adam laughed, the sound sharp as broken glass. He flipped to a page showing Judge Richard shaking hands with Emma in a dimly lit corridor. James' pulse quickened, unease crawling along his skin. "This is not possible," James whispered, his breath uneven. Adam leaned closer, eyes glinting. "Possible and real aren't the same thing." The warehouse doors creaked under the wind, and the dust swirled like restless spirits, cloaking the revelation in dread. Emma returned home that night, her apartment lined with tidy shelves and carefully arranged books. She paused at the mirror, staring at her composed reflection before whispering, "Secrets weigh more than chains." She removed a small lockbox from beneath the floorboard and opened it, revealing photographs of past trials and hidden letters signed with names she buried long ago. Laura called her phone, voice filled with desperation. "Emma, James is spiraling. He cannot carry this without you." Emma answered calmly, "I'll hold the storm until he sees the light." Yet her eyes shifted toward the photographs, her hand tightening as though holding them gave her control. Outside, the city lights flickered, casting sharp shadows across the ordered space. James drove to the courthouse parking lot, late at night, engine humming low as fog wrapped around the asphalt. He stepped out, staring at the looming marble pillars, as though they watched him back. The phone rang again, the same number echoing across the night. A hushed voice said, "You will never leave this clean." James' breath sharpened and he muttered, "Justice leaves scars. I've worn them too long." Laura approached from the shadows, clutching her coat. Laura said, "If you walk through those doors again, you may not return." James turned, his face carved with resolve. He whispered, "Truth waits behind locked doors, and I have the key." Laura's tears caught the dim parking lot light, and the fog carried every word into silence. The courthouse basement smelled of damp stone and dust as Investigator James pried open a rusted cabinet. Inside were files marked with dates that did not match the official record. James muttered, "Evidence buried in shadows always finds air." Laura entered quietly, her face pale. Laura said, "You should not be here. If they catch you, there is no way back." James glanced at her, his jaw set. He replied, "If truth hides, then we must drag it screaming into light." Suddenly, Adam appeared from the stairwell, clutching a folded page. Adam said, "You're looking in the wrong places. The story is never written in straight lines." James froze as Adam opened the page, revealing a crude sketch of Judge Richard speaking with Emma. The air thickened, and Laura whispered, "If this is true, then betrayal is closer than we thought." Later that night, Emma walked into a narrow alley where street lamps buzzed faintly. She met a man cloaked in shadow, his voice low. He said, Control is not about truth. It is about memory. Emma's eyes hardened as she replied, "Memories burn when they're chained to lies." The man handed her a sealed envelope, whispering, "Deliver this to Judge Richard, and all doors remain open." Emma clutched it, the weight settling in her palm like iron. Suddenly, James appeared at the alley's end, his silhouette cutting through fog. He called out, "Emma, tell me why you stand with them." Emma froze, her voice trembling yet steady. Emma said, "Because standing alone leaves no power at all." The fog curled between them like a curtain hiding darker truths. Laura returned to her childhood home, its walls lined with faded photographs and silent memories. She sat on the worn sofa, staring at a framed picture of her family. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "You should have been here to see this." The memory of the lingering memory filled the room, the laughter that never grew older, the song that never finished. Laura touched the sealed letter she kept hidden in her coat pocket, trembling at its unbroken seal. Emma entered quietly, placing a gentle hand on Laura's shoulder. Emma said, "Grief carves its own courtroom, and we are always on trial." Laura closed her eyes, and the air hummed with silence, as if the lost memory still lingered in the space between breaths. James stormed into his office with Adam trailing close behind. James slammed files on the desk, scattering loose papers across the floor. James said, "Every lead ends in smoke, every path vanishes into silence." Adam leaned against the wall, flipping through his sketchbook. Adam said, "That's because you're looking for doors. Truth is always in the cracks." James turned sharply, anger flashing in his eyes. He replied, "Cracks do not hold men accountable in court." Adam smirked, pointing to a sketch of Judge Richard exchanging envelopes. Adam whispered, "Then maybe the court is not where you'll find justice." The words hung like a knife in the room, as shadows stretched longer across the floor. Emma sat with Judge Richard in a private chamber, the walls lined with old law books. Judge Richard said, "Order depends on silence, not exposure." Emma's lips tightened as she replied, "Silence destroys more than truth ever could." He handed her a sealed folder, his voice steady. Judge Richard said, "Deliver this, and you will keep your world intact." Emma's hand shook as she accepted it, her composure cracking beneath the weight of hidden allegiances. Unknown to them, James watched through a crack in the door, his face cold with disbelief. He muttered under his breath, "The heart of justice rots in its own house." The chamber's stillness became suffocating, and betrayal took root in silence. The night draped itself heavy over the courthouse, as Investigator James studied the files stolen from the basement. His hands shook as he traced the signatures that linked Judge Richard and Emma to secret transactions. James whispered, "The pillars of justice were carved hollow." Laura entered the dim room, eyes widening as she saw the papers. Laura said, "This cannot be true. Emma would never betray us." James' silence told her otherwise. Suddenly, Adam appeared from the shadows, tossing another sketch onto the table. Adam said, "You want the truth? It's written in ink darker than law." The page revealed Emma handing a folder to Judge Richard inside the private chamber. Laura staggered back, whispering, "Emma, why?" The weight of betrayal cracked the air like a thunderclap. Emma walked along the riverbank, moonlight rippling on the water. She clutched the sealed folder Judge Richard gave her, her steps deliberate yet heavy. Emma whispered, "Every decision is a wound that never heals." Suddenly James appeared, his voice sharp as steel. James said, "You stood with us, but your hands carry their secrets." Emma turned slowly, her eyes glistening but unbroken. Emma replied, "Secrets are currency, James. Without them we are powerless." James stepped closer, his rage simmering. James said, "Power without truth is ash." Emma's grip on the folder tightened, her body trembling as she whispered, "Then watch how ash burns brighter than you expect." The river reflected both of them, fractured like the trust between them. Laura visited the cemetery where the lingering memory had once been honored with a simple stone. The air carried the scent of damp earth and silence. Laura knelt, whispering, "Your absence is the wound they used to chain me." A faint melody seemed to rise with the breeze, The sound of the tune once hummed in her childhood. Tears streaked her face as she touched the stone. Laura said, "I see now the pieces they hide, and I will not stay silent." A figure appeared behind her, and she turned to find Adam watching with sharp eyes. Adam said, "Ghosts never vanish. They wait for someone to listen." His words cut through the silence, and Laura felt the stone grow colder under her hand. Judge Richard stood in his chamber, staring at a portrait of past rulers. His voice was calm but sharp as he muttered, "Order is preserved by silence." Emma entered, setting the sealed folder onto his desk. Emma said, "James knows Laura suspects, and Adam will not stop." Judge Richard turned, his face carved in authority. Judge Richard replied, "Then truth must drown before it reaches the surface." Emma hesitated, her hands trembling as she whispered, "Every shadow leaves a trail, and they are closer than you think." His eyes hardened, yet for a moment, doubt flickered like a candle in the storm. The silence of the chamber grew heavier, carrying the weight of a crumbling empire. James confronted Laura in his office, the storm outside raging against the glass. James said, "Emma has bound herself to Richard, and the system is feeding on silence." Laura's voice cracked as she replied, "She carried me through nights I thought would end me. How can I see her as an enemy?" James placed the sketch. Adam delivered onto the desk, the image of Emma with Judge Richard, undeniable. James said, "Trust is not loyalty when it betrays justice." Laura broke into tears, whispering, "Then everything we believed in has turned to dust." Adam leaned by the window, lightning illuminating his smirk. Adam said, "Dust is where fire starts." His words lingered, heavier than thunder. The trial chamber thundered with murmurs as Judge Richard prepared to preside over the session. Investigator James entered, his coat drenched from the storm, placing a folder of secret documents on the table. James said, "Every word buried in silence now breathes in these pages." Emma sat at the bench, her face unreadable, while Laura clutched the edge of her seat, whispering, "This truth could destroy us all." Adam, restless at the back, sketched furiously, muttering, "Destruction is only the first step." Judge Richard struck the gavel, declaring, "This court will not tolerate theatrics." James locked eyes with him and whispered, "Then prepare for truth." The chamber lights flickered, and silence fell heavy, as if the walls themselves braced for fracture. James opened the folder, scattering photographs and hidden records across the courtroom table. He said, "These are the exchanges they never wanted seen." Laura gasped as she saw Emma's image with Judge Richard in dim corridors. Laura whispered, "Emma, tell me this is false." Emma's face twitched with a fleeting crack of guilt before she said, "Every alliance was survival." Adam chuckled from the back, muttering, "Survival breeds betrayal." Judge Richard's voice cut through the air, "This is inadmissible. Hearsay scrawled in shadows." James slammed his hand on the desk. James said, "It is more than admissible. It is your legacy." The crowd stirred, tension electrifying the air. Laura rose suddenly, her voice cracking as she shouted, "I trusted you, Emma, through every night of silence." Emma turned, her calm composure faltering as she whispered, "I protected you in ways you will never know." James stepped between them, his eyes locked on Emma. James said, "Protection does not excuse corruption." Judge Richard pounded the gavel again, barking order in this chamber. Adam scribbled furiously, muttering, "Order is just another mask." The audience whispered, torn between disbelief and shock, as the weight of betrayal hung like a noose over every word. The sound of rain against the windows echoed like pounding drums of judgment. James stepped closer to Judge Richard, holding up the sealed envelope discovered in the basement. James said, "This envelope carries names, dates, and the blood you traded for silence." Judge Richard's lips curled into a bitter smile. Judge Richard said, "You think truth is enough to unmake a throne built from decades of power?" Laura whispered brokenly, "Then justice is only a ghost." Emma's face hardened, her voice steady but laced with regret. Emma said, "Ghosts still haunt the living." The gavel struck again, but the echo no longer carried weight. It sounded hollow. Adam leaned forward, whispering, "Every throne crumbles when its pillars rot." The climax erupted as James tore open the envelope, scattering its contents before all. Photographs, letters, and signatures spilled like fire across the table. James shouted, "This is the rot within your empire." Judge Richard's mask cracked, his voice rising with fury. "You will regret this defiance." Emma lowered her head, whispering, "Perhaps regret is all we have left." Laura clutched the evidence, tears falling as she whispered, "Then justice demands blood." The chamber erupted with chaos, voices shouting, papers fluttering in the air. Adam slammed his sketchbook shut, whispering with a grin, "And so it begins." Lightning flashed through the high windows, and the storm outside roared into the heart of justice itself. The courthouse was nearly empty when the storm outside finally began to fade, leaving silence heavier than thunder. Investigator James sat at the defense table, staring at scattered evidence as though it no longer belonged to him. Laura approached slowly, her voice trembling. "If justice is won through loss, what remains for us to hold?" James lifted his eyes, hollow yet fierce, and replied, "Truth is never clean. It stains everyone who touches it." Emma entered quietly, her shoulders slumped, and she said, "Perhaps I have carried too many stains already." Adam leaned against the window, smirking faintly as he whispered, "Scars are just maps of where fire has been." Judge Richard lingered at the bench, the once commanding figure now shrouded in uncertainty. The chamber felt less like a courtroom and more like a battlefield drenched in ghosts. Laura walked with Emma into the courthouse corridor, her steps echoing against marble floors. Laura whispered, "You carried me through grief, but now I don't know who you are." Emma stopped, her face softening as she replied, "I was the shield, even if it meant standing beside those I despised." Laura turned away, tears forming. Laura said, "Shields crack when truth shatters them." Emma's gaze dropped to the floor, her voice barely audible, "And when they break, the wounds are shared." The silence in the corridor carried the sound of the storm's aftermath. Their bond, once unbreakable, hung fragile in the stillness. James returned to his office, the envelope now torn open and emptied across his desk. He whispered, "Evidence is a torch, but flames consume as much as they reveal." Adam sprawled in a chair across the room, flipping through his sketchbook with restless energy. Adam said, "You wanted proof, now you choke on it." James turned sharply, anger flashing in his eyes. James said justice was never meant to be clean, but it should not be poisoned. Adam smirked, holding up a sketch of Laura kneeling at a gravestone. Adam whispered, "Ghosts hold more power than any court." The office felt suffocating, the walls pressing inward with the weight of revelations. Emma stood on the courthouse steps at dusk, the city alive with flickering neon beyond. She clutched the sealed folder Judge Richard once gave her, now heavy as stone. James approached slowly, his voice sharp yet weary. James said, "Every choice you made chained us tighter." Emma's lips trembled, but she whispered, "Every chain was forged to shield someone I loved." Laura joined them, her eyes red from weeping. Laura said, "Then love has left us with ruins." The wind carried their words into the night, as the city lights blinked like indifferent eyes. The steps beneath them felt less like stone and more like graves. Judge Richard sat alone in his chamber, the once proud bench now cloaked in darkness. He stared at the folder James had torn open earlier, the contents scattered like broken glass across the floor. His voice cracked as he muttered, "Power crumbles fastest when it feeds on itself." Outside the door, James listened in silence, his hand pressed to the wood. Laura whispered to him, "Do you hear it? Even walls confess when they fall." James nodded faintly, replying, "This is justice, not pure, not whole, but undeniable." Emma stood apart, her face unreadable, as Adam leaned against the far wall, whispering, "Ashes don't vanish. They spread." The chamber's silence became the final sentence, written not by law but by consequence. The courthouse lay silent after the storm, its pillars glistening with rain. Investigator James stood at the steps, the folder clutched in his hand, its contents emptied into the world. He whispered, "Truth has teeth, and now it bites." Laura approached, her face pale, her voice trembling as she said, "I wanted justice, but it feels like grief dressed as victory." Emma lingered near the shadows, her eyes cast downward, murmuring, "Justice never comes without blood." Adam sat on the railing, sketching calmly, muttering, "You only see ruins. I see beginnings." Judge Richard emerged from the building, shoulders sagging, his voice cracking as he said, "Power cannot survive this light." The city loomed behind them, restless, uncaring, a mirror of their fractured souls. James and Laura walked slowly through the city streets, neon lights flickering in puddles. Laura whispered, "Every victory feels like loss when wounds stay open." James kept his gaze forward, answering, "Loss is the ink justice always writes with." Emma followed at a distance, her steps unsteady, her face unreadable. Adam darted between alleys, sketching fragments of the night, muttering to himself, "History isn't written, it's drawn in silence." The weight of the past clung to each of them, heavy as the rain-soaked air. For every step forward, it felt as though shadows pulled them back. Laura returned once more to the cemetery, the gravestone of the lingering memory glistening with dew. She knelt, whispering, "Your silence shaped us all, and we are still breaking beneath it." Emma stood a few steps away, her voice soft. Emma said, "The dead do not forgive, but they remind us who we are." James placed a hand on Laura's shoulder, his eyes hollow. James said, "Justice ends in silence, but silence is never peace." Adam traced the stone with his fingers, whispering, "Even ghosts leave trails." The cemetery seemed to hold its breath, the air heavy with unfinished stories. Judge Richard sat at his desk for the last time, the once proud chamber stripped of authority. He whispered, "Power is nothing when truth poisons it." His gavel lay abandoned, a relic of control broken by exposure. Emma entered, her voice trembling. "You held chains for too long. Now they shatter in your hands." Richard's eyes glistened as he replied, "Chains define us all, even when we pretend they don't." James stood in the doorway, silent, his presence enough to close the circle. Laura whispered softly, "Then let silence bury what law never could." The chamber fell still, heavy with endings. The city skyline flickered with neon as the night closed on their story. James stood at the rooftop's edge, staring at the horizon, his voice steady yet broken. James said, "Justice is never whole. It is a scar that never fades." Laura stood behind him, whispering, "Scars remind us that we survived." Emma leaned against the wall, her expression unreadable as she said, "Survival is not living." Adam drew the skyline in silence, sketching the fractured lights. Judge Richard's voice lingered in memory, echoing, "Order lives only in silence." The rooftop wind carried their words away, leaving only a haunting silence.